we're just, thank you, Phil, for hitting the recording. What we're going to do tonight is I hope we're going to give you a little information that'll get, I was listening to Phil on a podcast earlier today, and he said the phrase, get beyond bumper sticker BS. And I thought that was a great way to put this, is that, you know, we're going to probably find out that cutting foreign aid will not fix things, you know. So it's my pleasure to introduce Phil Smith. He's the National Field Director for the Concord Coalition. And Lord, he's been there over 2 decades, so it's hard to tell that he could do that looking like he does. Past president of Kiwanis in Atlanta, which is a huge chapter. He's an avid Georgia Bulldogs fan. And he's one of the best people I've ever met. And I'm so thrilled to be with him today for this short talk.
Bobby, thank you so much for having me. My only regret is that we're not doing this in person, but hopefully we can do that sometime soon. But one of the fun things about not doing it in person is we can bring in people from all over, right? So like John coming in from Minneapolis, and I know we've got people from not just Florida, but all over the place. I'm coming to you today from Athens, Georgia, home of the University of Georgia Bulldogs. So I grew up here. I can pretty much in this job live anywhere as long as I'm within a reasonable distance to a good airport. So I've made the case for Hawaii, but they won't let me live there for some reason. So here I am in Athens, Georgia. But I really appreciate you guys taking a little time to join us tonight to dive into some federal budget policy. That's what we do at the Concord Coalition. And Bobby is not only one of our top volunteers, she is our top volunteer. In fact, she received our National Volunteer of the Year award a couple years ago in DC, and I had the honor of presenting that to her there. And I wish y'all could have been there for that. It was a wonderful, Bobby, as you might imagine, she stole the show. And she did so even though
I woke them up after your 5-minute introduction is what I did.
Exactly. And I think I'm going down that same road right now. This always happens to me with Bobby. We're so fond of one another that but I could have a Bobby-thon if you let me. So I'm going to have to cut it off short. Otherwise, I'll go on and take up our whole time talking about Bobby. But she's done such a fantastic job, both in Florida and in Georgia for us. In fact, we did some of our best work probably more than a decade ago in Georgia. And Bobby chaired this Fiscal Stewardship Committee, which is where I got this banner behind me, where we assembled citizens to take a look at the budget and basically just kind of prioritize and try to see what is it that we want from our federal budget. And using our principles and our own priorities, trying to decide what should be working towards and what should we prioritize, basically. And that's really what we ask at the Concord Coalition. So today, our policy director, Tori Gorman, has assembled a really quick PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to go through with you to kind of bring you up to speed on where we are, because it's a very unique time in terms of the federal budget. We've obviously been experiencing a national emergency in the past year. So the Concord Coalition has been paying really close attention to what's been going on. We've never had a year like we just had in many, many ways, right? But especially at the federal budget level, because we've had to step up and really inject a lot of fiscal policy to kind of, we had a self-induced coma that we put ourselves in at the beginning of it, to try to battle the pandemic. And it puts us in a really unique place. But the Concord Coalition was actually founded back in 1992. In fact, before the call started today, we were chatting about that year. It was kind of a fascinating year for presidential politics. Almost everybody who ran that year was really, really into federal budget issues and talked about it a lot. Not so much now. You don't hear that in 2016 and 2020. You really didn't hear a whole lot of talk about budget priorities. Other things and other issues kind of took over. And I think it has an effect, because when people aren't paying attention to the budget, some interesting things do happen. And so our goal at the Concord Coalition has always been, since our founding, is to simply educate people about federal budget policy, in hopes that regardless of how you feel about it, because we probably have differing opinions about what the federal government should be doing, but regardless, we should be getting past the bumper sticker talk, as Bobby referenced, and diving into the issue. So hopefully we'll have a chance to do this tonight. Again, we're going to try to keep it to 45 minutes. So at about 7:45 Eastern time, we'll bring it to a close, but I'll try to save some time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start to share screen. And let's see, bring this PowerPoint up. The title of my talk this evening is federal deficits and debt, an unsustainable future. And the first chart that I'm going to show you is a bit of a history lesson from the year before last, actually. So before we even knew what the word COVID was, this is our last federal budget before the impacts of COVID took over. And you can see in this chart that we, of course, spent more than we brought in, which happens most of the time in Washington. And this particular year, we spent about $4.5 trillion, and we brought in about $3.5 trillion in revenues. So this was a good year. We had a decent economy that year. I mean, it wasn't fantastic growth, but we had decent growth, and there was no reason, to be running giant deficits in that particular year. But we almost had $1 trillion annual budget deficit in that 1 year alone. And again, that was before we even knew what COVID was. And when you look at all the different things that the federal government spends money on, they're stacked up right here. And at the very top is the one that probably concerns most economists who look at the challenges that we're talking about, and that is the amount of interest that we're paying. And in fiscal year 2019, we paid about $375 billion.
That's an extremely low interest rate.
Right. That's exactly right, because interest rates are where they're very, very low right now. And when you look further at this chart, and again, we're talking about everything the federal budget does. So we've got defense, you see the Social Security money in there, the major healthcare programs. That's something we could do an entire program on, just those alone, because if you want the federal budget to be sustainable, we've got to figure out a way to make our healthcare program sustainable. And with increases in healthcare costs year over year, that's one of the biggest things that we have to look at. Our defense budget is large. It totaled nearly $700 billion in 2019, but many people are surprised to see that it comprises only 15% of the overall budget. A lot of people think that it's more. And our foreign aid budget, Bobby mentioned this earlier, is frankly too small to appear on this chart. It's about 1% of overall spending. Let's see.
And defense is half of the discretionary money. Everything else we have to pay.
That's exactly right.
And net interest.
That's right. And I think that's where the confusion lies a lot of times, Bobby, is that a lot of times when you see defense, as double what it is, you're looking at only the discretionary spending. And so mandatory spending is the 61% of the budget at the bottom part of here. And then discretionary spending is this top part of the budget. Interest, by the way, is also considered mandatory. So interest really belongs with the mandatory budget as well. Mandatory meaning these things have to be paid, right? And so that's 2019. I wanted to show you that year to kind of put things in perspective. Now, the difference between the deficit and the debt, we were looking at an annual figure right now, last year, right? 2019 was an annual figure of almost $1 trillion in deficits. Every year that we run a deficit, it adds up to our overall national debt, right? And this is a chart of our national debt, and it shows as a percentage of the economy how much our debt has been year by year, going all the way back to 1900. Bobby and I have known each other almost this whole chart, right? And you can see that the biggest times that we had debt, if you're an American history buff, they coincide with big historical events. So we had a huge debt in World War I. We had a huge debt during the Great Depression. We had a huge debt that set the records for debt in World War II. You can see it was just absolutely through the roof. We basically bet the farm on World War II, and it was a good bet to make because we won that, and then we paid that down. And some of our best growth years in history were, when we were paying this down right here. But then something interesting happened in the 1980s. We weren't, in a major world war. We weren't facing a huge economic problem like the Great Depression or even a Great Recession. But our debt started going up a lot. So that's really when kind of the credit card generation started, and we started putting a lot of things on the credit card, so to speak. And then
that's absolutely what happened. As a matter of fact, I was watching a film of Hank Aaron hit his 715th home run, and I noticed that in the outfield there was an advertisement for Bank AmeriCard. If y'all remember, that's what Visa was, and it says just like cash.
Just like cash.
Just like cash.
Yep. And so that was the birth of the credit card generation, and that's a perfect example, Bobby, of. And then around the turn of the century, we had the Great Recession in 2007. But actually, around the turn of the century, right before the century, we balanced the budget for 4 years. Now, it didn't last very long, and the little surpluses we ran weren't large enough to really put much of a dent in things. And then when the Great Recession hit, 2007, 2008, we started running up our debt again. And then, of course, it might have been premature calling that the Great Recession, because we needed another name for the recession we just experienced last year, which was quite scary. So this chart is an interesting one in many ways, because it shows our outlays and our revenues going back to 1970. So the outlays, or the spending, is in blue here, and the revenues, they are in green. And it basically shows that on average, we've been taxing at about 17% of our economy, but we've been spending at around 20%. And that means we've been running annual budget deficits averaging around 3% of GDP. Recall, however, that the deficit in 2019 was actually at 4.6% of GDP, so much higher than these averages we've been seeing. And again, that was before COVID. Consequently, despite running a sustained period of relatively peace and prosperity, our debt has been rising, not falling. So let me take you to the next chart here. In early March of last year, this is when COVID hit, right? And these are the scary charts. In early March of last year, it became apparent that the coronavirus was spreading uncontrollably across the U.S. The president at the time declared a national emergency, and a collective decision was basically made to put the economy in what I called earlier the self-induced coma, to send everybody home, or most people home, to quarantine in place, except only the most essential workers. And as our businesses shuttered for, we didn't know for how long that was going to be, many workers, they lost their job, and it pushed the unemployment rate up more than 10 points in just a span of 1 month. So the employment situation obviously has improved, but at 6%, it is still, relatively high compared to the pre-COVID numbers that we had right before COVID started, around 3.5%. So, but that was a scary moment in time back in March of last year, when we went from 4.4% to 14.7%. That was really scary. The COVID-induced recession that we had was very, very deep. In fact, by March, the U.S. economy had officially entered a recession. In the first quarter of 2020, our real GDP contracted by 1.3%. From the previous quarter. In the second quarter, it contracted by 9%. So, in fact, if the second quarter contraction, that thing was so steep that if it had persisted over the course of an entire year, our domestic economy would have lost 1/3 of its value. So it was really obvious that Congress and the president were going to need to provide a backstop, for the spiraling economy. And then, based on the lessons that we learned from the Great Recession, lawmakers knew that they would have to act pretty swift and pretty strong. So how did Washington respond? Well, in the span of about 3 weeks in March, Congress and President Trump enacted 3 pieces of legislation, each more ambitious than the last. First, they spent several $1 billion on vaccine development, disease tracking, medical supplies, and lab capacity. Then they spent hundreds of billions of dollars on paid sick leave for the employees of small businesses. Then they spent $1.7 trillion on a whole host of counter-cyclical measures, including tax rebates for individuals, for families, expanded unemployment insurance, new loan programs, and temporary tax cuts for small businesses and large corporations, and then money for state and local governments to help cover the cost related to fighting the coronavirus. So when you see a comma in these billion-dollar numbers, that means we've graduated to trillions here. So in the span of about 3 weeks, Congress just threw the proverbial kitchen sink at the virus, appropriating nearly $2 trillion. So lawmakers came together 2 times more in 2020 to provide additional COVID relief, including a $900 billion package in this past December that included $600 relief checks for individuals, an additional 10 weeks of pandemic unemployment benefits, and even more financial support for small businesses and schools. An overwhelming majority of the aid packages in 2020 followed an established bipartisan rubric for emergency spending that we talk about a lot at the Concord Coalition, that we call it the 3 T's. Was it targeted, and was it temporary, and was it timely? So timely, targeted, and temporary, the 3 T's. And in total, the federal response to the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020 totaled $3.1 trillion. And of course, all of this was financed with new debt. Now, after President Biden was inaugurated, the newly Democratic-controlled Senate and House got to work on a 6th COVID relief bill. And this was the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, which was enacted a couple months ago, a bill so large that it exceeded the size of the CARES Act from a year ago. And this is even though the economy and the jobs market today are a lot healthier than they were at that time. So not only is this bill, it's now a law, shockingly large, there were parts of it that did indeed deviate from that bipartisan litmus test that we talked about, the 3 T's. For example, $1,400 per person recovery rebates. This was an amount in excess of the CARES Act rebates, and on top of the $600 rebates distributed back in December. And those checks get paid to all the eligible people, regardless if they experienced any loss of income. You just had to fit within the income requirements to get it. It included a $360 billion in direct aid to states, even though many of the states really don't need it. Not all the states are created equal in terms of how they face these crises. And we've learned that states with income tax-based budgets actually fared much better than expected during the COVID recession. And you might ask, why is this? Well, because unemployment insurance benefits, which were significantly increased and expanded to a broader category of people in 2020, are actually taxable as income, as Bobby knows. And so as a result, many states did not experience the large drop in tax collections if they thought they might. And in fact, only those states that rely on a sales tax alone, or that have regional economies tied to tourism or energy extraction, experienced the really significant budget stresses that we were worried about. This bill also included $125 billion for elementary schools, 60% of which won't be spent until 2023 or later. And it included about $90 billion to support underfunded union pension plans. Again, a noble cause, but a problem that existed long before the pandemic, and it's not really related to the global emergency that we're facing right now. So the American Rescue Plan Act also included a number of temporary provisions that Congress will be under significant pressure to make permanent. So we're watching that very closely. And a good example of that would be the expanded child anti-poverty tax credits, such as the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and the child dependent care tax credit. Making these temporary provisions permanent would probably cost us over $1.3 trillion over the next 10 years. So we'll be watching that pretty carefully. Now, again, it might be very good policy to make these provisions permanent, but if we do, the state of our federal finances strongly suggests that the Congress and President should find a way to offset these costs. So all told, when the costs of the American Recovery Plan are added up to the 2020 packages, so going back to March of 2020, Washington has appropriated $5 trillion in emergency COVID relief funds. And again, all this has been financed with debt. So,
trillion is a hard number to understand, but I always tell people 1,000,000 seconds is 11 days about, and 1 billion seconds is about 33 years. And 1 trillion seconds is 33,000 years. And I think that gives you some idea of how big a number we're talking about.
It really does. And I appreciate you saying that, Bobby, because when you graduate from 1 billion to 1 trillion, most people just think you're jumping up to the next level. And it's a lot more than that, right? It's an exponential jump when you're doing that. As a result of these large annual deficits, our national debt, the portion held by the public, is projected to rise sharply from 16.8 trillion in 2019 to 25.2 trillion in 22. And so that's 26% larger than we thought. Let me make sure I'm on the right chart here. This slide tells us something really interesting, and that is we have some significant consequences both on our near-term deficits and our long-term deficits. So going into 2020, we thought we were going to have $1 trillion budget deficit, which is in this red portion here. And we thought that we would have another $1 trillion deficit in 2021. and another $1 trillion deficit in 2022. So basically, we thought we were going to have $1 trillion deficits. But then after everything we've done, we now know that, 2020 is in the book. So we know now that we actually had more than a $3 trillion instead of $1 trillion. It was $3.1 trillion for 2020. And in fiscal year 2021, instead of having a $1 trillion deficit, it looks like we're going to have a $3.4 trillion deficit. And then depending on what happens, of course, right now we're projecting a smaller deficit in fiscal year 2022, but we'll have to wait and see. And then with our national debt, again, you can see how that's grown based on all of these. And you can see that, again, this is what I was mentioning earlier, that debt held by the public in fiscal year 2022 is projected to be 26% larger than we originally estimated in 2020. Now, our nation's fiscal challenges, they do not end with COVID-19. And you can see that our annual budget deficits as a percent of GDP rise sharply. So you can see here that that we'll have a waning budgetary effects of COVID-19 in the next couple of years, and the deficit comes in. But look what happens in the late 20s and the early 30s. Our deficits start to rise again. And by the mid 2030s to late 2030s, we start entering this kind of emergency level of deficits, but without the emergency, right? I mean, this is excusable, right? Because we're in the midst of an emergency right now. And that won't be the case in the future. And so growing deficits and debt, they will remain long after the budgetary effects of COVID are gone. And in this chart, you can see just how far we're going. So by the
Am
year,
I right to expect that as that deficit grows, that discretionary spending just shrinks and shrinks as interest gets higher, and mandatory spending gets higher? The money we have left for everything else is small, unless, of course, we borrow it.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's a very good point, Bobby. So healthcare inflation, the aging of America, and net interest costs really are driving up our spending. So when people ask Bobby and I, when we get beyond COVID, what are the main drivers? Well, they're the same drivers that we had before COVID, frankly. Mm-hmm. And these are the main parts of it. So the change of an outlays as a percent of GDP from 2019 to 2051, this is where the big growth is expected, right? And you can see that a huge chunk of it is in healthcare, right? In fact, if you add up Medicare and then the first part of this chart, Medicaid, CHIP, that's the Children's Health Insurance Plan, and the program, and the exchange subsidies, that's Obamacare, represents 0.8 increase, but then Medicare is over 3.3 increase. Then you look Social Security's schedule. This is a percentage of the GDP, so don't let these small numbers fool you. These are, when you talk about 1% of GDP or 3% of GDP, this is mammoth. And of course, the really thing that scares us the most is what's going to happen with interest over that time period. So even though we have a lot of different opinions on what, I'm sure even within this Zoom call, we have a lot of different opinions about what the federal government should be doing, but there 6.8% GDP growth in net interest, that's just mammoth. And then really all other parts of the budget are scheduled to actually shrink over this time period. So if you're not talking about these parts of if you want to know about the challenges and how to make things sustainable, we've got to make reforms in these areas if we're going to make any progress at all.
And we've got to make it so that healthcare costs do not inflate at twice the rate of everything else, because who pays the most for medical costs in this country? We do. Our government does. And it just has to be sustainable. Big problem.
That's exactly right. Bobby, I just realized we had some people in a waiting room, and I apologize. I just let them all in. So we had a whole chunk of people just join us. So we welcome each of you, and we ask that you please place yourself on mute, and we welcome you to our program. So right now we're talking about interest, and the opportunity costs of net interest payments are really, really high. And as you can see here, how net interest contributes to future budget deficits, you can see that the primary...
Yeah, the one that just came out, yes.
Teague, would you mind pressing mute, please, sir? And so you can see that our primary deficits and net interest payments as a percentage of GDP, where we are here now in the year 2021, hopefully that will come down. But as you can see in the 2020s and as 2030s start, we're getting the interest payments are going to be absolutely through the roof.
And this chart is done on current interest rates, correct, Phil?
That's right. It assumes that we could have as high as a 1% increase in interest rates with some of that. So if it gets back anywhere near the more historical levels that we had, this chart could be even worse.
Yes, families go through this.
That's right. That's exactly right. I think we need Ethel to mute. Ethel, if you wouldn't mind, get a little bit of feedback from Ethel.
I'm having trouble, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
It's on the bottom left of the screen, Ethel. There'll be a mute, a little microphone.
Let me see. I might mute everybody. Let me try to do that real quick.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I think I muted everybody. So Bobby, you need to unmute yourself now.
Thank you.
Okay. Still getting a little bit of feedback though, aren't we?
Ethel.
Huh.
Ethel, you're on twice.
Oh, she is. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right. Bobby, I'm gonna mute everybody one more time. So then once I do that, you unmute yourself. So Bobby, go ahead and unmute yourself again. Okay, and then we will go back to the screen. Let's see. So we were looking at interest payments, and by 2045, CBO projects that net interest payments will exceed what we spend on Social Security. So for those of you that wondered, do deficits matter? here's a pretty good explanation that they do. There was a chart. Let's see, just to refresh your memory, let's go back to this chart that I showed you earlier and review the revenue line. You can see here that the historical proportion of revenue collections relative to the size of the economy has been relatively constant at approximately 17% of GDP, right? And this trend is expected to continue in the future. In essence, this chart tells us that federal revenues are projected to remain flat relative to the size of the economy. So tax revenue will grow, but it will grow at the same rate as GDP, unlike spending, which is expected to grow much, much faster. So why do revenues remain flat? Recall that here in the US, our revenues are driven largely by income taxes. And remember this chart that showed nearly 60% of our total revenues are generated by the income tax, and most of them come from the individual income tax, right? So, and income taxes in turn are driven by economic growth. So when the economy grows, wages grow. But our economy can only grow as fast as we can produce output. And output, of course, is the goods and services that others want to purchase. And our output is constrained by two key variables: the size of our labor force and the productivity of those workers. So what do we know about the size of our labor force in the future? Well, you've probably heard this before. We're marrying later and we're having fewer children. And as a result, our future potential labor force is projected to grow only 1/3 as fast as it has in prior years. So how do we
today about the declining birth rate in America?
Absolutely. And I thought maybe COVID would help it. If we were all cooped up together, maybe we'd have some more babies, but evidently we don't like each other enough. And even though we're cooped up, we didn't have any more babies. So how do we know this to be true? Well, it's because the workers of tomorrow have actually already been born and we can count them, right? We know how many 5-year-olds we have. We know how many 15-year-olds we have. So what does this chart tells us? The takeaway here is that we can't grow our way out of our debt problem, at least not with the known demographics that we have today. To be more specific, the odds of returning to the days of sustained 4 or 5% economic growth per year are simply not possible unless we do something to increase the size of our labor force. And by the way, that's another class, maybe even with another teacher, Bobby, about how to have more babies.
Well, I will say there is some good news there. If you're an older person and you want to work longer, you are not going to have age discrimination because the labor force needs us.
That's right.
Let's do it.
That's exactly right. You give hope for us, Bobby. So Also, there's a dirty little secret that's buried in our revenue forecast that I want to show you here that underpin the Congressional Budget Office's projections on deficits and debt that I've presented here. The revenue forecasts are probably too optimistic. So when we're looking at these revenue forecasts, keep in mind that back in 2017, Congress and the Trump administration enacted a series of temporary tax cuts, that benefit individuals, families, small businesses, large businesses. These tax cuts expire at the end of 2025. And
Not
the
the
revenue,
corporate tax cuts, just
right? Yeah, I'm sorry, just the business, individual and families. They expire at the end of 2025. And the revenue forecast presented here assumes that Congress will let that happen on schedule. But guess what? 2025 is preceded by what? A presidential election year, 2024. And those candidates are going to be under enormous pressure to extend those tax cuts or to make them permanent, much as they did with the Bush tax cuts in 2012. So as a consequence, our deficits and our debt will probably be larger than what's presented here. Even scarier than the accumulation of debt, though, that we've been talking about today, is the precious time that we're losing to take corrective actions. Even if policies, say that our policymakers in Washington strike a grand bargain within the next few years, significant savings would absolutely be necessary. So this chart shows that if Congress and the president set a goal of reducing future debt to just say 100% of GDP by 2050, basically holding at the current debt level, and implemented those policies, say, starting in 2025, lawmakers would have to find savings equal to nearly 3% of GDP. To put this in context, the first year savings alone would need to total about $730 billion, essentially the equivalent to eliminating almost the entire Department of Defense in 1 year, or imposing a head tax of $2,200 per person. And we'd have to repeat that year after year. And if Washington waits even longer to act, the required policy changes get even more severe. Say if lawmakers were to wait until 2030 to act, by the way, when Social Security Retirement Trust Fund is within just a few months of exhaustion, which is entirely plausible because Congress did exactly that back in 1983. And the amount of savings then, though, would have to be nearly 25% larger than if they started in 2025. So if the numbers that we presented here today are large and scary, they really are. And maybe it's time to put them into context within our own lives. In fact, I bet many of you are asking yourselves, why should I care about our nation's debt and deficits? Let me give you some reasons to think about. First, kind of like climate change, once our debt becomes a conspicuous problem, it might be too late to do anything about it. As we saw with Greece and Portugal during the Great Recession, fiscal crises tend to occur quickly, accompanied by a swift and steep decline in investor confidence. And that's something that should grab all of our attention, that everybody wants to know, when is it going to happen? And I think I don't want to know when it's going to happen, because if we know when it's going to happen, it means it's too late. Because when investors don't want to buy our debt because they think we can't repay it, then interest rates can spike in a matter of days and spawn a devastating credit crisis that reverberates around the globe. Second, a large and rising debt burden reduces the fiscal space we need to respond to the next crisis. And we don't know when that will be. Will be next week, will be next month, next year.
but there will be one.
There absolutely will be one. And in fact, we've suffered two historic global crises in the span of a dozen years, the Great Recession and the COVID crisis that we've been going through. And in between, we've seen climate change ravage the West with fire, flood in the plain states, hurricanes down in your neck of the woods, Bobby, that have increased.
So we've got to make some hay while the sun shines. When the
Amen.
economy's doing really good, we have to be fiscally responsible and pay ourselves back so we can get some slack in the road.
That's exactly right. And then I'd say, thirdly, our fiscal security is also closely linked to our national security and our ability to maintain a leading role in the world. As Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, once put it, the most significant threat to our national security is our debt. And as our national debt grows, not only are we more beholden to our creditors around the globe, but we have fewer resources to invest in strength at home. Fourth, I would say we've largely been using debt to finance consumption rather than investments in capital and in labor, the things that will make our economy more productive. So as a result, our roads and our bridges are crumbling. Tap water in many inner cities is polluted with toxins. Our public schools are overcrowded and failing to educate our children. College is beyond the reach of so many people. Our technical colleges have been on decline, and technology has not been deployed equitably, to say the least. These sacrifices have had an enormous cost to our economy, to us, and then to the children, to our children. Fifth, we've seen today that interest costs, even under today's low interest rates, will grow and crowd out needed investments that are important. And as I noted earlier, by 2045, net interest payments are projected to exceed the size of Social Security, perhaps even earlier if today's low interest rates rise. So moreover, 30% of our debt is held by foreign countries. Those interest payments leave the United States and don't recirculate here. So simply put, net interest is really a huge opportunity cost for us.
I think some people will be surprised because everybody hears that China owns all our debt. No, only 30% overseas, but that's a big number.
It is a big number. It is indeed a big number. And then lastly, I would say, if nothing I've said so far compels you, then consider this. The current era of political polarization, our close elections, and aging societies give politicians on both sides strong incentives to leave the debt problem for future generations, your kids, your grandkids. So we have to ask ourselves, is this the legacy that we want to leave behind? But I will say the good news is it doesn't have to be this way. By educating ourselves, our friends, our colleagues, and then interacting with candidates for higher office, asking them tough questions and demanding straight answers, holding our leaders accountable for their promises, and then by getting involved with organizations like Bobby does here with the Concord Coalition, I think we all can be much more involved in these issues and really make a difference. Here's some ways.
I did want to say one thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I can't leave them on that kind of cheerful note.
No.
Is that part of what we did in the fiscal responsibility thing is we had volunteers come into sessions in Atlanta. Okay. And they were such a diverse group. I mean, you just can't imagine any person or sector that wasn't represented in there. And if they came together, we didn't let them sit together. And we divided them up into tables of 8. And we gave them the budget exercise, which Concord has, and you can go see it or schedule it for your group or whatever. And it basically gives you choices on what you could do to balance the budget and how much it would cost you, as scored by the CBE. Well, what I did notice is that while the big takeaways were people were willing to give up stuff, they were willing to make some changes in their life. They were willing to take Social Security a year later. They were willing to pay a higher gas tax. And this is conservative. Once they understood the problem, because that's what we did first, was explain the problem. And then we spent 30 minutes on how to have a constructive conversation around it instead of just getting stuck in a rut. All they really wanted was personal responsibility. They wanted that to be part of whatever happened. But for their grandchildren, they were willing to make some changes that really would be impactful. Higher gas tax, like I said, a little bit more income tax. They were willing to do it. And it didn't matter if they were people who were making $40,000 a year or people who were making $400,000 a year. You saw a lot of agreement in that group. First of all, they were talking to each other like people, and I'm not sure quite how we do this, because there's so much misinformation out there. But there are Americans that are willing to give things up. We've just got to get the conversation back to the problem and get away from sound bites.
Bobby, I think you're exactly right. And I couldn't have closed in any better way. Y'all see why we bring Bobby to Washington all the time, because she makes a lot of sense. And I love to get her in front of these policymakers. I wish you guys could be with me sometimes when right before COVID, we visited members of the Florida delegation, and Bobby really helped get people's attention to these issues. What I'm sharing with you on the screen right now are ways to get in contact with us. So there you see our website at the top, concordcoalition.org. Please subscribe to our newsletter that goes out periodically. It's called The Lookout. Feel free to download and share our podcast. Bobby mentioned that earlier. It's called Facing the Future. This week's is a very interesting podcast. We have a couple of experts, including an epidemiologist that talks a lot about what's happening right now. And then follow us on social media, host an event And if you know of any place where this chart talk can occur, or Bobby mentioned our federal budget exercise, we love to go to college campuses and host those, but we could also do them, at your local church or community groups, Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, any of those type places that you think where we might have an opportunity to do that. Please do join us. We would love to take advantage of that. So at this point, does anybody have any questions for Bobby or me?
I do. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Mhm.
I'm Tom Murray. I'm a friend of Bobby's and known her for a zillion years.
yeah, we won't
I'm
tell them about our 25th birthday, but okay.
Yeah, well, I'm curious about your views on the right to work situation in various states and how that affects fiscal activity.
When you say right to work, you mean the legislation around the country?
Yeah. You know,
You
where,
mean no unions?
yeah, well, no, I don't mean no unions. I think unions are great, but I think there's some question as to whether or not people should be forced to join unions or required to contribute and pay due, what is it, the fair, I forget what they call it, but where you benefit from the union activities, even if you don't want to be part of the union. And so they make you pay. I think the public union sector is a place that is very divisive among a lot. I live in Kentucky, and it's not real popular here, but that's not why I don't think people ought to be forced to pay join a union or pay for it. So how does that enter into the big picture with prosperity and economic success for us all?
Right. From the fiscal perspective, at the national level, one of the things that we pay attention to are the pension plans, that
Right.
oftentimes do that. So that's something that we watch very, very closely. And there are not all pension plans are created equal, much like I said earlier when we were talking about fiscal. So you have some pension plans that are in trouble, frankly, and weren't well funded enough. So,
that's an understatement.
Right? It's an understatement, and actually have to be bailed out. And in that case, sometimes the taxpayers wind up bailing them out, depending on what policymakers do. So that is one area that we look at in terms of, of what's happening with that. And then, Bobby, is there anything that you would want to add to that as to how this relates to fiscal policy?
My first thought was, at least for a healthy pension plan, the person would have some income when their Social Security goes to hell in the handbasket.
Right.
But and when I do financial plans with a pension, boy, it sure is different than doing one without a pension. But I don't see how we're talking about this particular, fiscal deficit. I don't see it as impacting that.
Well, and then Bill King was writing in the chat box here too. In Texas, the difficulty is that the legislature is so absorbed with cultural wars right now that getting legislators to even think about good governance is extremely difficult. And I would say we definitely see that at the federal level too, that people are so tied up in those cultural wars that we don't have time to talk about these things.
Let me be real specific. Part of the proposed infrastructure plan includes a lot of money to states, and in order to fund their pension plans, which are seriously underfunded.
Right.
Illinois is a good example of that. New York is a good example of that. Pennsylvania and California. And I'm sorry, but a lot of people see that as just giving away money to these guys that have made terrible decisions about pension plans,
right?
Because they can't pay for them.
Well, and the thing that I alluded to earlier in our presentation today is that regardless of the merit of this argument, what we should be looking at right now when we're passing legislation, right, is it timely, temporary, and targeted, because we're trying to get through this current emergency and address the things that need to be addressed at this moment. And that, that's separate and apart from the COVID. So I see your point. And I think that it's a debate that the country needs to have, right? But maybe it needs to be had, after they deal with the temporary and targeted and timely issues that the Congress
If
should
we
be
can get
facing.
around the culture wars, as Bill says. I mean, we have a lot to talk about here. We have a lot of really serious stuff to talk about.
Yeah,
And-
well, one of the serious things to talk about is $1.9 trillion that Congress wants to vote on in the next couple of weeks. A big chunk of that money is going to pay for pension plans that the states didn't manage.
If they go belly up, do you think that we're going to pay anyway? And at least
No. I don't want them to go belly up. I just, think that should be part of the debate. But it seems to be, we just need to vote for $1.9 trillion and let it go away.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think you're going to see that. I don't think you're going to see $1.9 trillion.
1.7, whatever. I mean,
But like Phil says, the 3 T's, it keeps coming back to that. And y'all know I've got a liberal heart, but it's got to keep going back to those 3 T's. And this means making a decision between what's an investment and what's an expense too. And I think we've been spending a lot of money, like Phil says, just on consumption. And it's like your own family. If you spend money and you don't get anything for it, it might have been a great meal or whatever, but it's gone. So how are we going to spend our monies in a way that feed our future? And that's the heated debate.
That's a good question.
It really is. So we've hit the 45-minute mark, and I know that I promised you guys we would try to keep this at that much. So if somebody has to leave, we certainly understand. But Bobby and I are available to continue taking questions if we have any others.
I appreciate y'all so much.
This has been great.
Do.
Yeah.
I really do.
Thank y'all so much for coming tonight.
I have a question.
Yes, Ken, go ahead.
And I just counted up over 40 years ago, I started seeing in the government that the way budgeting, and I've seen this countless times, and I won't say it's universal, but it seems to be, if we have money in a budget for one line, whatever that line is, and just for an easy number, we have $10,000 budgeted. At the end of the fiscal year, everyone rushes to spend. If they've only spent 7,000, everyone rushes to spend that last 3, because if we don't spend it, they'll cut our budget next year.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't understand why it's hard for anyone to understand. Don't do that. If we're punishing people or departments or department chairs, whoever, for being fiscally responsible. So if you're budgeted $10,000 this year and you only spend 7, then next year we'll budget you for $10,500. Don't waste that last 3,000. Apply it to next year. And I have seen countless examples of people rushing out to waste money starting in the late 70s when I was in college.
Right. Now I've seen the same thing.
Why is it so hard to understand something simple like that?
I agree. And it's very frustrating. I saw it too. I'd spent about 2.5 years in state government in Georgia, where I noticed some of that too. And this was even after one of our governors had attempted to institute zero-based budgeting. It's a hard thing to get around, and it's so anywhere where we can increase the efficiencies is certainly a good place to start.
It's all about management incentives, and I think it's really hard to structure good management incentives. And we keep driving away our most capable people who might actually come up with a good idea, because who would want the job, frankly?
That does concern me.
Thank you for answering that. And how about them dogs?
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate it. Go Dogs. I'm a little nervous. We're a few weeks away from kickoff.
I love it.
Bobby, you didn't have any Gators on this call, did you?
No.
Oh, look,
Oh,
Ken's sitting next to a Gator.
I forgot y'all were a mixed couple.
I love it. So y'all should come to Washington, Ken, and show people how to get beyond partisanship.
So I got a question for you guys.
Yes, Fred.
First of all, I don't think anybody can rationally say we're ever going to pay this debt back. It's not going to happen.
No.
And they're going to continue to spend money. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, they always spend more than they have. So shouldn't we be preparing for the crash? as opposed to thinking you can fix this, because you can't fix it. I don't care if everybody puts in $2,200 a year. It's not going to happen. And they're going to keep spending more than they have. And that's how our system is lubricated, by the way, because the Fed has to keep money flowing.
I think the answer, you're right in that we'll never pay it all back. I think the way we've got to get it, even though we can't pay it all back, we have to somehow put it on a sustainable course, right? And because we really don't want the crash. The crash looks ugly. The crash means we give up the goose that's laying the golden egg, which means right now, the dollar is the de facto currency around the world. We're currently the world's largest economy. We're currently the world's most trusted economy. Basically, when people buy our bonds from all around the world, they believe in our taxpayers' ability to pay that back more so than any taxpayer, any country in the whole world, right? That you add up all that together, that's our goose that is laying a golden egg for us. And if we can figure out how to make our fiscal policy sustainable, like if we were only going to have budget deficits of say 2.5% of GDP over the next 50 years, there probably wouldn't be any need for the Concord coalition. But it's a lot worse than that. We see this yawning gap. And so we've got to figure out how to make it sustainable. And I don't want to go to that crash that you're talking about, because oftentimes when I'm asked that question, like if I'm on a television network and there's a Wall Street guy next to me, the Wall Street people always say, oh, yeah, we agree with Phil. We agree with the Concord coalition, everything they're saying, but we don't see any evidence of those concerns in the bond market yet. And I'm like, and you don't want to, because that's not the canary in the coal mine.
There's tomorrow. That's
the coal mine crashing if the bond market starts acting bad, right? Based on these things. So yeah, I do think that it is impossible to pay it all back. So what we do is we make it sustainable, and we just got to make sure that our debt doesn't far exceed our annual output or our growth. And right now we're nowhere near that. Right now our debt is scheduled to just absolutely skyrocket. And at some point, if it becomes so bad that people lose faith in the United States of America and in our taxpayers to pay back those bonds, then that's the ugly crash. So right now we're hurtling in our car about 100 miles an hour, and we're looking at each other asking us, where is the cliff? And I'm like, I don't want to know where the cliff is. I want us to do something before we get to the cliff.
I don't know how long ago it was, but maybe 5 years ago, they downgraded U.S. debt. And what happened? Everybody went and bought U.S. debt because they still thought it was the safest thing in the world. The day that doesn't happen, the slide will be quick.
That's right. The former Comptroller General of the United States, David Walker, used to say, right now we're the best looking horse in the glue factory. So we've got to do something about that.
So how do you see productivity entering into this? You were talking about the birth rate, and we aren't, getting enough workers and stuff, but isn't productivity supposed to increase and make up for some of that?
It would, and but your numbers can't be, productivity can only do so much, right? You still have to have
I don't know how much it can do.
I don't know either, but
they keep talking about electric doing, everything under the sun.
Right. And so the question is, what limits are there? I would argue that it's not unlimited, but what are those limits? And but those are the two driving forces, right?
That's an unknown.
It is an unknown, but what is known is the size of our labor force, which affects the product rate. Yep. And there's only
assumptions about productivity, i.e., the number that would be required to get us out of this ditch is simply unimaginable that would happen.
I don't disagree with that. I think our debt is an awful, horrible.
And see, it's interesting. We also have conversations with people. There's a new thing called modern monetary theory, and they don't think the debt means anything. They think that we can just print money forever.
I have arguments with my brother all the time about he doesn't care how much money they print. Just give people money.
And the funny thing is, we've heard that on both sides of the spectrum, right? I mean, we heard a few years ago, a famous Dick Cheney quote was, "Reagan proved deficits don't matter." We heard that on the right. Now we have the MMT on the left saying deficits don't matter, but deficits are money. And I can assure you, money matters.
I agree with you completely. I think it's a big problem. I've always thought that.
And we've got to have some real leadership is what it is that ask us to do the hard things because we've got to tackle Social Security. Okay. When 65 was set as the retirement age, it was patterned Bismarck from the 1880s, and it's because everybody was dead by the time they were 65. You know,
Right.
that's weren't many survivors. And here we are today using 67. Now, do I think people who get to 62 and they work with their bodies all their life and they're worn out? Yeah, they probably deserve some benefit. But let's face facts. I'm sitting here waiting until 70 and I'm getting an 8% raise every year that I wait. You know, the only people who can do that? Probably the people who don't need the Social Security so
Right.
much. You know, what I'm
And
saying?
probably people whose wages have not gone up very much, right?
Right. So we need to tell people, we need to tell 30 or 40-year-olds right now, it's going to be 70. We can't tell a 63-year-old, oh, by the way, when you're 60, you have to wait till 80. We just have to have the hard conversation.
That's
Why
exactly right.
is it so hard to convince voters that that's the right policy?
They don't want to talk about it, and it's complicated. I did a workshop the other day that said people would rather believe a simple falsehood than a complicated truth.
But that's not a good answer, Bobby.
Huh?
That's not a good answer, really. I mean,
Bobby deals with it
it's
every day.
complicated.
here
People
doing
don't want to
what
hear
I
it.
I'm sitting here doing what I can. Thank you for coming, you know.
Mhm.
But you know, just remember when it comes to something you want money spent on, I want you to say, well, do I really need that money to be spent? You know, be willing to give up some of your piece of the pie.
I don't want money spent on nothing, to tell you the truth.
Tom, I'm afraid you're never going to be elected to Congress.
I think you're right. Although I'm thinking about running for the school board.
Well, listen, I encourage people all the time. Please step forward. As Bobby said, and you know, a lot of good-hearted people and smart people decide not to get involved nowadays.
Yeah.
And it's really a shame because, by the way, when good people decide not to run, somebody else will.
Yeah.
So,
And
no,
I
I'd
do-
get crucified. I wouldn't ever go there.
I do want to remind people that if you have a civic group, if you have a college class, like some people I know, if you know the professor of Eco 101 or something like that, and they would like a presentation, we'd love to give it. You know, we'd love to give it.
yeah. Bill asked a question in the chat. In 500 BC, Athens, not Athens, Georgia, by the way, but Athens, Greece, was the first democracy collapsed because of wealth inequality between the landowners and everyone else. Would I like to comment on that? I think there are lots of historical examples like that. The thing that scares me is when each of these societies started thinking that their money was magic or that money didn't matter, you know, and they became overly extended. In certain ways, you start to see I know a lot of people look to the fall of Rome. You know, Rome got overextended and so forth. There are lots of examples of how a society gets overextended and then collapses. I think we have a lot of potential in this country. Don't get me wrong. I know that we have a lot of challenges, obviously, and we've talked about a lot of them here tonight. But the thing that does scare me sometimes is when I hear people say that we don't need to prioritize or that we don't, that we can spend an unlimited amount of money over time. I mean, it's one thing to throw a lot of money at an emergency like we have over the past couple of years, right? But it's another thing 5-6 years from now to still be having emergency level deficits without the emergency.
And once again, when things are going good, maybe don't cut taxes and put some of that money towards the debt.
Well, and the saddest thing about those tax cuts that we had back in 2017 is there really wasn't even a lot of real tax reform in there. It was just kind of straight up tax cuts. It was such a missed opportunity. We could have had tax reform in 2017.
I agree with that.
But instead they just, took the easy route and they didn't want to go the bipartisan route, work with other people to do things to make the tax code better and more efficient and just.
The tax code is terrible.
Oh, it's a
And
nightmare.
the tax cuts,
absolute nightmare.
that was just a whack on the top, and a lot of people benefited, a lot of people didn't benefit, and
And I use it completely to my advantage for my clients to try to make sure they pay the least possible. There's no doubt about the fact that I do that, but
Of course you do. That's your job, and that's what
I
you're
know,
supposed to do.
I know.
And that's why we take her talents to the federal level, and we say, all right, let's be fiscally responsible. But at the end of the day, Bobby's going to do for her clients, whatever Congress and the president has decided what the tax code is. You've got to make decisions based on that. But we hope to improve on that in the coming years. And with your help and maybe getting involved, if you guys have know of any places where this presentation would be worthwhile, please let us know. And again, that budget exercise is a lot of fun. If y'all want to do that.
Budget exercise is where the meat is.
This is a 2-hour. This is a 2-hour
It's on
long
the website. You can do one by yourself and see if you can balance the budget. When we did it, I think we sold California and only got it to balance for 1 year.
Bobby, I'm going to guess you didn't get a whole lot for California. That could have been
Actually,
the
we
problem.
did. Well, yeah. Well,
Bobby's got relatives out there, so maybe she got them back
they
first.
get more than they take out, so we'll keep California. But that was a joke. But it's very. If you do it, you'll be very interested in how hard it is to make it work. It's very hard to make it work.
Mm-hmm. It really is. And this exercise, it takes about 2 hours, but people pretend like they're a member of Congress, and we divide them up into groups, and they have to vote on about 40 different options on what to cut, what to keep, what to extend, what not to. And they basically assemble a 10-year federal budget plan in this exercise, and it's loads of fun. So Bobby, let's get people together and do that sometime again soon.
That I would be. I'm game. I'd even come to Milledgeville, Georgia, to do one of those. If anybody would
I
do
love it. Well, yeah, that's funny because that's where the mental institution was when I was growing up. It was in Milledgeville. So when people say they're going to Milledgeville, sometimes it was for different reasons. But I want to thank everybody so much. Bobby, we've hit the hour mark, so maybe this is time to say goodbye. And again, thank you all
Turn
so
out
much.
the lights. The party's over.
Thank you very much, Bobby and Phil. I enjoyed the whole session.
Thank you,
and I'm
Tom.
glad
Thank
I
you,
got to
Ken,
be part of
Bill,
it.
everybody. It's
Hey,
great to see
Mary,
y'all.
Laura, Ethel, Ken, Pat, Bill King, Tom, and my dear Phil. It was wonderful to work with you, and we will do it again.
Let's do it. Thank y'all so much, and we will see y'all again soon, I hope.
All right, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you. Thank you, Bobby.